There are lands out west where the sun falls low and paints the earth in colors of rust and gold, where the wind carries dust and the cry of hawks, and where life itself is often measured by how much a body can endure. Out there, folks lived with less comfort than most would care to admit, but they carried their burdens with grit and quiet prayer. It was in such a place, on the edge of wide pastures and a narrow stream, that a little girl named Lydia found herself standing before a door that no longer felt like her own. Lydia had once known laughter in that house. She had once known the warm voice of her mother, singing soft as the evening crickets, her gentle hands smoothing the child's hair as bread baked in the hearth. But that time had gone, carried off like smoke on a cold wind. Sickness had come one winter, swift and merciless, and when it passed, it left the house empty of the woman who had been its heart. Lydia's father, Eliza, worked the soil and tended the beasts with all the strength a man could muster. But even the stoutest of men could not raise a child alone without some sort of help. And so, before the next spring came, he brought home another wife. Marta, they called her. She had the kind of eyes that looked sharp as flint and a smile that never warmed the room. At first, Lydia tried to believe her father's promise that this woman would bring care back into their home, that Marta would see Lydia as her own. A child's heart, after all, is quick to hope, even when reason warns against it. For a few short days, Lydia thought perhaps life would be mended, that sorrow might be patched with new beginnings. But it did not take long for the truth to reveal itself. Marta kept her voice sweet around Elias, offering him bread with honey when he returned dusty from the fields. Yet once his back was turned and his boots set outside the door, her sweetness soured. She saw every slip of Lydia's hand, every small mistake, as if each were a crime worthy of punishment. If Lydia dropped a spoon, Marta narrowed her eyes. If the child lingered too long at the well, Marta's words cut like thorns. "You're slow as a snail, girl," she would mutter, or "no supper for clumsy hands." Each word left its mark, not only on Lydia's stomach, but on her tender spirit. It was hunger that became the cruelest of Marta's weapons. For each misstep, no matter how slight, the woman would shut the pantry door and leave Lydia with nothing but water. A missed chore meant no bread. A late return from the pasture meant no stew. A crookedly folded blanket could cost her a whole meal. Lydia would lie in her small bed as the moonlight fell across her thin blanket, the sound of her stepmother's children eating echoing in her ears. Her belly growled, and still she whispered prayers into the night, asking for strength, asking for mercy, asking that her heart not turn hard like the woman who tormented her. Her father never saw it. Elias worked until his shoulders bent and his hands blistered. He trusted Marta's word, trusted that the girl was being cared for. At the table, he would see his daughter nibbling at the crust she was given and smile, believing all was well. Lydia, afraid to trouble him further, said nothing. She swallowed her tears the way she swallowed the crumbs, holding them deep inside where no one could see. The seasons rolled on. Spring rains fed the fields, summer heat baked the soil, and Lydia carried out her chores with quiet endurance. She fetched water from the stream with arms that trembled from weakness. She carried what heavier than her frame should bear. And when Marta found fault, and she always found fault, the punishment was the same: no food for the child. Still, Lydia did not let bitterness take root. She told herself that one day, kindness would find her again. Until then, she would endure. And so the house that once rang with her mother's laughter grew silent, but for the sound of Marta's sharp tongue and Lydia's quiet footsteps. A new home, it was called, but to Lydia it was little more than a place of testing, where each day was a trial of patience and faith. What she did not yet know was that the world beyond that door held strangers, and not all strangers were cruel. Some bore kindness enough to change a life, though she could not yet imagine such a thing. For now, she carried her hunger like a shadow and whispered to herself that the sun always rose again after the longest night. The West is a hard teacher, and hunger is her cruelest lesson. Folks say you can walk barefoot across thorns, you can sleep under a sky that pours rain, you can even face down the rattlesnakes in the grass, but it's the growl of an empty belly that breaks a soul faster than any whip. Lydia came to know that truth early, for her stepmother, Marta, had made hunger the law of the house. It was a strange law, too, for it was not written in books or spoken aloud for neighbors to hear. It was carried instead in the narrowing of Marta's eyes, in the way her hand tightened around the bread knife whenever Lydia spilled a drop of milk or left a chore unfinished. Every mistake, no matter how small, was measured against the child's portion. Drop the bucket at the well, and supper was gone. Miss a corner while sweeping, and breakfast disappeared. Even the smallest accident could mean a day of nothing but water. Lydia's father, Elias, never saw the law in action. He came home from the fields weary, his hands scarred and his back bent, and Marta placed food before him as though she were the most dutiful of wives. He ate heartily, never knowing that his daughter sat nearby with her plate nearly bare, or sometimes with no plate at all. The woman's children ate their fill, their laughter echoing against the walls, while Lydia sat with folded hands, her stomach gnawing at her from within. She was told to be grateful for what little she had, and she was too afraid to argue. The body of a child weakens quick without food, but Lydia's spirit was strong. She learned to carry her hunger the way others carried burdens of work or grief. At night, she would curl up beneath her thin blanket, her belly aching, and whisper prayers into the silence. She prayed not for Marta's hand to soften, though such a thing would have been a mercy, but for her own heart not to turn cruel. "Let me stay gentle, Lord," she would murmur. "Let me not be like her." There were small tricks she learned, born of desperation. A crumb of bread left on the table could be tucked into her apron and eaten later by the well. A drop of milk in the bottom of a cup could be swirled and licked clean, giving her strength enough to rise another morning. Sometimes, when no one watched, she chewed on grass or leaves, not because they filled her, but because they gave her mouth the feeling of eating. It was pitiful fare, but a child will do what she must to keep standing. The days stretched on, and the seasons turned as they always do. In the heat of summer, Lydia hauled water from the stream, though her arms trembled. In the chill of autumn, she bent to gather corn husks while her head swam with dizziness. And when the winds of winter began to bite, she carried wood that seemed heavier than her small frame could bear. Marta watched, always waiting for a slip, and when it came, as slips do for any child, she gave her sentence. "No bread for you tonight. Or worse still, go to bed. You've earned nothing today." Yet for all the sharpness of her punishment, Marta's cruelty could not silence the voice inside Lydia that whispered of hope. She remembered her mother's songs, though faint now with time, and she remembered her father's rough hand patting her shoulder when she was small. The world was not all cruel, she told herself, though her corner of it seemed filled with bitterness. Somewhere beyond the walls of that house, kindness still lived. She clung to that thought like a candle flame in the dark. Sometimes, when Elias lingered in the fields until night, Marta would send Lydia to bed early without even water to drink. She would lie there in the shadows, her stomach hollow, listening to the laughter of her stepmother's children. And though the sound pierced her like thorns, she never let her heart harden against them. They were children too, and it was not their fault. She bore her pain alone, as if carrying it might spare them from a measure of it. But hunger leaves marks. Her cheeks grew pale, her arms thin. Her hands, once quick and strong, shook when she tried to hold a bucket. Marta mocked her weakness, saying, "You'll never be useful if you don't learn." Lydia bit her tongue and answered with silence, for she knew if she spoke back, her punishment would only deepen, and she had no strength left to risk another day without food. And so the hunger became her shadow. It followed her to the well, to the fields, to the fireside where she knelt to blow on the flames. It gnawed at her when she woke, it lingered when she slept. Yet still, beneath all the pain, she kept a quiet seed of faith. Someday, she told herself, someone would see. Someday, someone would hear the cry her lips never spoke. For the West may be a hard teacher, but it is not without its lessons of mercy. And though Lydia did not yet know it, the days of her starving were numbered. The wind was already shifting, carrying her story toward the ears of a stranger whose heart had not been hardened. Winter in the West has no kindness for the weak, and Lydia felt its hand more sharply than most. The season came creeping down from the mountains, white and silent, until it covered the plains like a blanket no one asked for. Where others saw beauty in the snowflakes, Lydia saw only another burden to carry, another trial to bear. Cold has a way of making hunger worse, for when the body shivers, it burns what little strength it has left. And Lydia's strength was already stretched thin as thread. Marta, her stepmother, did not ease her hand when the frost came. If anything, the woman's cruelty sharpened with the cold. She sent Lydia to fetch water from the stream, even when the edges froze solid and the ice cracked beneath her feet. She ordered the girl to gather wood from the far side of the pasture, where the snow lay deep, though Lydia's boots leaked and her fingers burned from the chill. When the child's steps grew slow and heavy, Marta called her lazy. And if the woodpile was not stacked to her liking, she denied Lydia her portion of supper, saying, "Work first, food later. That is how you'll learn." So it was that the days shortened, the nights grew long, and Lydia's hunger grew sharper with every chore. Her hands, once soft with youth, grew cracked and red from carrying buckets and logs. Her breath came out in puffs of white as she bent to her tasks, and more than once she swayed with dizziness, nearly dropping the load she carried. Still, Marta's eyes were always watching, waiting for the smallest slip. And slips always came, for no child, no matter how strong, could carry such weight without faltering. One evening, when the wind blew so fierce it rattled the shutters, Lydia stumbled while crossing the yard. Her arms, stiff with cold, could not hold the wood she carried, and the logs fell into the snow. She bent to gather them, her knees trembling, but Marta's voice cracked across the yard. "Leave it. Go inside. You've earned nothing tonight." And so Lydia crept in her bed with no food, her body aching, her teeth chattering beneath her thin blanket. She curled herself small and whispered into the darkness, "Help me endure. Just let me endure." Her father, Elias, saw none of this. He came home each night so worn that he hardly lifted his eyes from his plate. He trusted Marta's word, trusted that his daughter was cared for. And Lydia, afraid to shame him or add to his burden, never told him the truth. She kept her silence, even when her stomach cried out. Her loyalty to her father was stronger than her hunger, though the hunger tore at her like a wild beast. But there were moments, even the cruelest winter, that gave Lydia reason to hope. When she walked to the stream in the early morning, she sometimes saw deer moving gracefully through the trees, their breath rising in soft clouds. Their strength reminded her that even in the harshest season, life found a way to survive. And when the stars lit the sky at night, she whispered her prayers to them, believing they carried her words higher than the roof of that cold house. Yet the season wore on, and her body grew weaker. Her cheeks hollowed, her frame thinned, and her hands trembled more each day. Marta mocked her fragility, calling her useless as a reed in the wind. The woman did not see, or did not care, that the child's body was breaking under her rule. Hunger had become a companion Lydia could not shake, a shadow that clung to her at every turn. Still, Lydia's spirit did not break. She forgave Marta in her heart, though she never said it aloud. She whispered to herself that bitterness was a heavier chain than hunger, and she would not let it bind her. She believed, deep down, that kindness still lived somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills. She believed that one day, someone would see her struggle and offer a hand. And so she endured the winter's cruelty, step by step, day by day, carrying her burden in silence. She did not know that the turning of the season would soon bring more than the thaw of ice. Somewhere beyond the frozen fields, a rider was making his way through the land, a man whose heart carried both sorrow and kindness, and whose path would soon cross her own. For the West may be hard, but it never lets cruelty have the last word. The winter that year cut deeper than most, and it was during those cold days that Lydia's path first crossed with the man who would change her story. His name was Jonas, a rancher who lived a few miles off, past a creek and a line of tall cottonwoods that bent in the wind. Jonas was no stranger to hardship. He was a widower, left with 3 children to raise and a stretch of land that demanded more from him than one man could easily give. Folks in the village respected him, not because he was wealthy, but because he bore his burdens with quiet strength. Where another man might have bent beneath sorrow, Jonas held steady, working his fields by day and guiding his children by night. It was on a frost-bitten morning that he first saw Lydia. She had been sent by Marta to fetch water from the well, though her body was so weak that even the handle of the bucket seemed too heavy for her hands. The cold had bitten her fingers raw, her lips were pale, and her frame looked fragile as a reed. Jonas, passing by on horseback, reined in when he saw her struggling. He sat for a moment, watching. Some men would have looked away, telling themselves it was not their business. But Jonas had known hunger once himself, in the days when his wife's sickness had drained the house of laughter and coin alike. He recognized the look of it now in the child's hollow cheeks and the tremor of her arms. "Morning, child," he said at last, his voice steady but kind. Lydia startled, nearly dropping the bucket. She glanced up with wide eyes, afraid to speak, for Marta had warned her often not to chatter with strangers. Yet there was something in Jonas's gaze, something steady, without cruelty, that loosened her fear. "Good morning, sir," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Jonas dismounted and walked toward the well. "That bucket's near as big as you. Let me give you a hand." He lifted it with ease, filling it from the well and setting it back beside her. Lydia stared at the full bucket, then at him, and for a moment the world seemed to still. No one had lifted a burden for her in a long time. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes lowering, as though even gratitude might earn her punishment. Jonas studied her a moment longer. He could see the bones of her wrists, the thinness of her frame. Something tightened in his chest. From his saddlebag he drew out a piece of bread, rough and brown, and held it toward her. "Here, you look like you could use this more than I." Lydia hesitated, her hands trembling. Marta would call it stealing if she returned with food, but her hunger was stronger than her fear. She took the bread, clutching it close, and whispered again, "Thank you." A tear slipped down her cheek, unbidden, and she turned quickly so he might not see. Jonas saw anyway. He said nothing, only placed his hand on the horse's reins and gave her a nod before mounting again. He rode on, but the image of the frail child lingered with him long after the road curved away. In the days that followed, Jonas passed that way more often. Each time he found reason to stop, sometimes to draw water, sometimes to ask after the weather, sometimes for no reason at all, but to see how the girl fared. And each time, he found her weaker, thinner, as though the winter itself were consuming her. Quietly, without fanfare, he brought what he could spare, a heel of bread, a slice of dried meat, a small jug of milk. Lydia accepted each gift with wide eyes and whispered thanks, her voice trembling between fear and gratitude. Jonas's children noticed his absences. Eli, the eldest, asked, "Pa, where do you go when you take the creek road so often?" Jonas only smiled and said, "There's a child who needs feeding, and we have bread enough to share." For his children, who had known sorrow but never cruelty, the answer was enough. They began saving small portions from their own plates, Ruth folding bits of cheese and cloth, Daniel tucking away apples, and handing them to Jonas to carry on his rides. For Lydia, each gift was a miracle. She ate in secret, hiding crumbs in her apron pocket, swallowing quickly lest Marta see. The food gave her enough strength to rise in the mornings, enough to carry her through Marta's endless punishments. More than that, it reminded her that kindness still lived in the world. A stranger had seen her suffering and had not turned away. And though Jonas had given only bread, he had planted something far greater in Lydia's heart: hope. For the first time in many long months, she believed the cold might not last forever. The West was a place of hardship, yes, but it was also a place where a single act of mercy could break through the hardest frost. Jonas did not know yet what role he would come to play in the girl's life, nor did Lydia know how deeply his kindness would shape her path. But on that winter morning by the well, as the bucket filled and the bread changed hands, the first seeds of a new story were sown. There comes a time in every story when kindness grows too large to stay hidden, when quiet deeds done in secret must step out into the light. For Lydia, that time arrived on a night when the wind howled through the hills and the snow lay thick across the pastures, muffling the world in a heavy silence. She had grown so thin by then that even Marta's own children had begun to notice, though they dared not speak of it within earshot of their mother. Lydia's cheeks were hollow, her dress hung loose from her shoulders, and her steps faltered when she carried the wood. Yet still Marta's eyes stayed sharp, and her hand withheld food as quick as ever. It was Jonas who could no longer bear to watch. For weeks he had offered bread and meat in secret, slipping sustenance into Lydia's hands as though passing messages no one else must see. But mercy once planted grows, and Jonas was not a man who could ignore suffering for long. He had 3 children of his own, each one with a seat at his table and a portion before them. To see another child starve while his own were fed was a weight upon his conscience heavier than any stone. One evening, as Lydia struggled at the well, Jonas dismounted once more. He studied her a long moment, then said, "Child, come to my house tonight. My table has room, and my fire burns warm. No one should go hungry in weather such as this." Lydia froze. The thought of stepping into another home filled her with both wonder and fear. Marta's voice rang in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. "Do not beg, do not take what is not yours." And yet, her stomach twisted with such pain that she could hardly stand. Jonas's voice was steady, kind, without the edge of command. "You'll be welcome," he said, and with those words, a door opened in her heart. That evening, when the shadows stretched long and Marta sent her to bed without supper for spilling a cup of milk, Lydia crept from the house. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked, guided by the glow of lanterns in the distance. Her hands shook, not only from the cold but from the fear of being caught. Yet each step carried her closer to warmth, and her heart beat with a strange mix of dread and hope. Jonas's house stood firm against the winter winds, built of heavy timber and lit by the fire within. When Lydia knocked, the door swung wide, and she was met by the sight of 3 faces turned toward her. Eli, tall and broad for his years, regarded her with quiet curiosity. Ruth, her hair braided neatly, smiled with a gentleness that eased Lydia's trembling. Daniel, the youngest, grinned as though he had been waiting for her all along. "Pa's been talking about you," Daniel said cheerfully. "Come on in before you freeze." Jonas ushered her inside, closing the door against the storm. The warmth of the hearth wrapped around her, making her eyes sting with sudden tears. She had forgotten what such warmth felt like: the heat of a fire, the sound of laughter, the smell of food cooking in the pot. At the table, bowls were set, bread lay in a basket, and stew simmered in a heavy iron pot. Jonas pulled out a chair. "Sit, child. Tonight you eat with us." Lydia hesitated, afraid even now that it was some trick, that Marta's scolding voice would leap from the shadows. But when Ruth reached over and placed a piece of bread in her hand, smiling as though it were the most natural thing in the world, Lydia's resolve broke. She sat, bowed her head, and whispered a prayer so soft only the Lord could hear it. "Thank you." The first spoonful of stew brought tears to her eyes. It was rich with meat and vegetables, flavor she had nearly forgotten. Bread passed from hand to hand, milk poured into her cup, and laughter rose around her like music. Eli told a story of the calf that had broken free from the pen, and Daniel laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Ruth reached to wipe the drops from the table, and Jonas leaned back, watching his children with quiet pride. And Lydia, thin, weary, trembling Lydia, felt herself drawn into that circle as though she belonged. For the first time in many long months, she ate until she was full. Her stomach, long accustomed to aching, now ached for another reason: the strange fullness of plenty. She looked at the faces around her, each one lit by firelight, and a warmth filled her chest that no blanket had ever given. When a meal was done, Ruth pressed another piece of bread into her hands. "For tomorrow," she said simply, as though it were nothing. Lydia clutched it as if it were treasure. Jonas laid a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. "There'll always be a place for you here, child. Don't you forget that." Lydia walked home that night with bread in her apron and hope in her heart. Marta's cruelty still waited for her behind the door, but now she carried a secret stronger than hunger, the knowledge that somewhere nearby, kindness lived. She had sat at a table where no one scorned her, where laughter rang and bread was shared. It was a memory she could return to again and again, a light against the darkness of her daily trials. The West may be harsh, but it also teaches this truth. A table with one more seat can change a life. Jonas did not know yet how deeply he had altered Lydia's path, nor did Lydia know how far his kindness would reach. But from that night on, the cold seemed a little less bitter, for she had tasted warmth, not just in her belly, but in her soul. The weeks passed like clouds drifting slow across a wide prairie sky, and in that stretch of days a change began to stir in young Eliza's bones. Where once her steps dragged heavy with hunger, they now carried her steady from dawn to dusk. The rancher, Mr. Turner, had made it plain. So long as she stayed under his roof, she would neither want for food nor for kindness. His 3 children, Matthew, Lydia, and Samuel, had taken her in without question, each in their own fashion. Matthew, already near to manhood, showed her how to saddle a horse with care. Lydia, sweet and quick of wit, shared with her the secrets of sewing and kitchen craft. And Samuel, still a small boy, found in her a willing ear for his endless questions about the world. But it was the meals that left the deepest mark upon her heart. For years, Eliza had sat at tables where a single mistake meant an empty plate, where every bite was weighed against her stepmother's anger. Now she sat at a table where bread was passed freely, where laughter filled the air as plentiful as the scent of roasted meat, and where no one measured her worth by the crumbs she left behind. Each evening, when Mr. Turner bowed his head to give thanks, Eliza felt a strange warmth in her chest, as though the simple words of gratitude stitched a torn part of her spirit back together. It was not an easy change. More than once, Eliza caught herself flinching when she dropped a spoon, waiting for harsh words that never came. She would freeze when she spilled a drop of milk, her breath held tight, only to hear Lydia laugh softly and fetch a cloth. "It's nothing, Eliza," the girl would say. "We all make a mess now and then." Slowly, those old chains of fear began to rust, until one day Eliza noticed she no longer sat stiff-backed at the table, but leaned in with the rest, telling her own small tales of the day. Mr. Turner watched all this with the quiet eyes of a man who had known sorrow and still believed in second chances. He saw the way Eliza's hands shook less each day, the way her cheeks filled with color where once they had been pale. He saw, too, the flicker of doubt that lingered in her, a shadow of the life she had fled. And though he did not speak of it, he carried within him a resolve to show this girl that home could be a place of safety, not a place of hunger. There came an evening when a storm rattled the shutters and drove the family close around the fire. Mr. Turner set a great pot of stew upon the table, steam rising thick and fragrant. As each child took their bowl, he ladled a portion for Eliza, larger than she was used to. She hesitated, eyes wide at the generous helping. Seeing her pause, Mr. Turner set the ladle down and spoke in his slow, steady drawl. "Child, no one here goes hungry. Not while I've got work in hands and land to tend. You've earned your place at this table same as the rest." Eliza's throat tightened, but she nodded and took her spoon. The stew was rich, full of flavor, but it was not the taste alone that filled her. It was the knowing at last that she need not starve for another's anger, that mistakes would not strip her of the right to eat. With every bite, she felt herself planting roots deeper into this soil of kindness, her spirit beginning to grow again. And so it was that the rancher's table became more than a place for meals. It became a teacher, a healer, and a reminder that survival does not end with escaping hardship. It is found, too, in the gentle mercy of those who choose to share what they have, even when they need not. For Eliza, it was the proof that sometimes help from a stranger can bloom into the sweetest chance at family. The prairie has a way of stretching a man's thoughts wide, the horizon reminding all who dwell there that life is both harsh and generous, cruel and kind. For Eliza, those endless skies seemed to whisper that her story was not finished. Though she had found safety on the ranch, her heart still carried the scars of her stepmother's cruelty. Hunger had gnawed not only at her belly, but at her trust, her hope, and her sense of worth. Healing from such wounds takes more than warm bread and kind words. It takes the courage to forgive, even when forgiveness feels undeserved. It was one quiet morning, the kind where the sun lifts slowly over the hills, that the past came riding back. A neighbor brought word that Eliza's stepmother, Ruth, had been seen in town. She had fallen on hard times. Her fields lay barren and her larder empty. With her pride broken, she was living in the shadow of the very hunger she once used as a whip against Eliza. The news struck Eliza like a blow. Memories of empty plates and long nights with nothing but tears for supper rose fresh in her mind. She had dreamed, in those dark days, of someone coming to save her. But no one had come until Mr. Turner. And now, when she had finally escaped, she was asked by fate itself, would she harden her heart against Ruth, or would she choose another path? That evening, as the family sat at the rancher's table, Eliza grew quiet. Mr. Turner, wise enough to read the shadows in her eyes, set down his fork. "Something's weighing heavy on you, child," he said gently. Eliza lifted her gaze and told them of Ruth's plight. The children were silent, waiting. At last, Eliza whispered, "Part of me wants her to feel what I felt, but another part wants to forgive." Mr. Turner leaned back in his chair, his weathered face softening. "Forgiveness ain't the same as forgetting, Eliza. It don't excuse what was done, but it frees you from carrying the bitterness that can poison a soul. Sometimes surviving ain't just about filling your belly. It's about letting go enough to keep your heart alive." Those words settled deep in her. Days later, Eliza found herself walking into town, a basket of bread upon her arm. She found Ruth seated on the steps of a boarding house, shoulders bent, eyes hollow. For a long moment, Eliza simply stood there, the old fear and anger rising like a storm. But then she remembered the rancher's table, the laughter of Lydia, the warmth of Samuel's small hand, the kindness freely given when she had nothing to offer in return. She stepped forward and set the basket beside Ruth. Her stepmother's eyes widened, confusion battling with shame. "What?" Ruth croaked. Eliza's voice trembled, but it carried the strength of the prairie wind. "Because I know what hunger feels like, and I will not wish it on another, not even you." Ruth bowed her head, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. Whether she would change, Eliza could not know. But in that moment, Eliza felt the chains of the past slip away. She had survived, not by clinging to vengeance, but by choosing mercy. When she returned to the ranch, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold. Mr. Turner met her at the gate. He did not ask what had passed, but he saw the peace in her eyes. "You found your strength, girl," he said simply. And so, Eliza's story became one not only of survival, but of forgiveness. She had been starved for every mistake, yet found nourishment in the kindness of strangers. She had known cruelty, yet discovered that healing comes from choosing not to pass that cruelty along. The prairie had given her hardship, yes, but it had also given her second chances. In the end, the moral of her journey was plain as the open sky. Even in the harshest places, grace can grow. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not in overcoming others, but in overcoming the bitterness within ourselves.